Thank you, Liz, very much. And I would indeed say that Net Impact is a very high-impact organization. So Liz and I walking over here, I was saying, I think you actually embody almost all of these practices that we found in our research. So I'm thrilled to be here today, and particularly thrilled to welcome a fabulous panel of experts from the organizations that I write about with my co-author in our book, Forces for Good, the 6 Practices of High-Impact Nonprofits. The book literally just came out last week, so my co-author and I are in the midst of sort of a national book launch tour, and we couldn't imagine a more perfect audience for this message than a group of Net Impact leaders from chapters around the country. So we're really honored to be here to share our findings with you today. And in particular, I wanted to introduce our panelists, and then I'm going to have them say a few words about themselves and their organizations and what they do, because you may not all be familiar with every organization represented here on the panel today. And then I'm going to give you guys a very, very high-level overview. I promise I'm not going to bore you with lots of PowerPoint slides. We're literally going to spend 5 minutes talking about some of the surprises in our research, and then most of the panel is actually going to be directed at having the panelists talk about how they use these practices to really build and lead their high-impact organizations. So I want to start out by introducing Anne-Marie Burgoyne, who is from the Draper Richards Foundation. Anne-Marie, they were actually one of the funders of our research and acted as a fiscal agent, and so she's going to share a little bit about the funders' perspective on this work. But Anne-Marie, why don't you just say a few words about yourself?
Hello, I'm Anne-Marie Burgoyne. I'm with the Draper Richards Foundation, which is a San Francisco-based foundation that funds early-stage social entrepreneurs. We look for people that are very formative in their stages of work. Some people have done a pilot or a demonstration project. Some people we fund off business plans. We really look for entrepreneurs, and so we're agnostic as to the topics and geographies in which we fund, but we do have a bias toward people that want to grow. We use words like aggressive growth, scale, replication, and then one of the hallmarks for us is not only that we give money away, but we try to build a learning community, which means we typically sit on the boards of people we serve, as much to help them build board capacity as to share best practices. We convene our fellows once a year, and periodically we do operational calls where we invite people from throughout the portfolio to come together to learn together. And I've been lucky enough to see several iterations of this work as it's come to be an actual book. And very early, from when Jenny Stein, who's my colleague at the foundation, and I learned about these materials, we started to use them both, the ideas, both working with our fellows and looking for people to fund as signaling mechanisms. And so I'm excited to share some of those experiences with you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. David Yarnold is the EVP of Environmental Defense, and when I found out he actually had a background in journalism as well, I quickly recruited him for the Stanford Social Innovation Review. David, why don't you say a few words about your work?
Pleasure to be with you today. Environmental Defense is a group of public policy entrepreneurs. We're devoted to environmental advocacy in 4 primary areas: climate and air, land, water, and wildlife, oceans, and human health. We do that using excellent science, great economics, and business partnerships. When I tell my friends in Silicon Valley what makes environmental defense different from other environmental advocacy groups, I say that our goal is to let efficient markets find great solutions that harmonize bottom lines and environmental benefits. We're 40 years old today. I am a 2.5-year-old environmentalist. I threw my life over about 2.5 years ago, through over a 27-year career in journalism, to do something I felt that gave back more to society. Haven't regretted it for a minute. I had no idea that environmentalism would become the hot topic that it has in the last year, and I had no idea that journalism was going to go in the tank the way it has. So that's how I'm here. That's my organization. It's a pleasure to be here at Impact.
Thank you, David. We also have Ami Eubanks, who is the Chief People Officer at Teach for America, and I know they're here on campus recruiting at the Career Expo as well. So, Ami?
Yeah, sure. As you all may or may not know, Teach for America is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to go after some of our nation's most promising future leaders on college campuses and inspire them to teach for 2 years in some of our nation's most under-resourced schools, K-12, across the country, everywhere from rural South Dakota to New York City to Los Angeles to places like Hawaii and Miami. And we do this through trying to aggressively recruit this great top talent who's never actually potentially thought about teaching after college. And we hope that given the 2-year experience in the classroom, that those core members will go on to believe that our nation's greatest social injustice is educational inequality, and really try to figure out how to continue to build the movement to end that. And so whether they stay in the classroom and continue to teach, or if they decide to go into another sector, hopefully through their experience they will want to figure out how to make sure that all kids in our nation have a promising future and an equal chance in life. I was a 1995 core member in Greater New Orleans, and basically through Teach for America launched my own personal career in the education nonprofit sector. But then also I've had the great fortune of coming to Teach for America at a point where we were really trying to grow our impact, and we're in the middle of a pretty aggressive growth campaign, and we just want to make sure that we're doing everything possible to sustain ourselves and to help the greater sector as much as we can, especially around sharing resources and talents and all of that, so that the sector can really help all of our nation's children have a better trajectory in life. So I really look forward to talking more with all of you all today, and thanks to Net Impact for having me.
Thank you, Amy. And we also have Mary Mountcastle, who has really helped Self-Help Credit Union out of North Carolina lead the anti-predatory lending movement in this country. So they've actually been in the headlines a lot lately, fighting a lot of what we're seeing happening in the mortgage industry. So Mary, why don't you tell us a little more about Self-Help?
Sure. I work with Self-Help, which is a Community Development Financial Institution, or CDFI, if any of you are familiar with that acronym. And our mission is to create and protect ownership and economic opportunities. Oh my. I hope that wasn't me. Oh, now it's on. Okay, I can hear it. So our mission is to create and protect ownership and economic opportunity for people of color, women, rural residents, and low-wealth families and communities. And we do that through providing financing to homeowners, primarily first-time homeowners, small businesses, and what we call community facilities such as charter schools and childcare. And as Heather referenced, if I had said to you a year ago that we were a subprime lender, you probably would have had no idea what that means. Unfortunately, because of the sort of the meltdown in the subprime lending market, probably all of you now know what that means. But we are a subprime lender, meaning that we lend to higher risk individuals and businesses. And then we have also an advocacy public policy affiliate called the Center for Responsible Lending. And just to give you a quick snapshot of our impact, we're 27 years old, and in that time we've provided just over $5 billion worth of financing to about 55,000 small businesses and homeowners around the country. A lot of that is through our homeownership programs, but our small business and community facility programs have created over 27,000 jobs, over 25,000 child care spaces, and over 17,000 charter school spaces. And our policy affiliate has become a national leader in anti-predatory lending practices and has, we estimated, saved about $4 billion a year for families in terms of the legislation that has been passed.
We're going to hear more about your advocacy efforts in a few minutes. I want to give you guys just a very, very quick high-level overview of some of our research findings. My co-author and I were really inspired by books like Built to Last and Good to Great in the for-profit sector. And what was interesting to us, we both have had long careers in the social sector, and my co-author Leslie works at Ashoka helping lead their Global Academy of Social Entrepreneurs. I think what was interesting to us is in our work, there were plenty of books on how to build a nonprofit board or how to write grant proposals, or books like Kim Collins' monograph, which took findings from the business sector and then figured out how do you apply that in a social sector context. But nobody had actually gone out and studied the highest performing nonprofit organizations to figure out what really makes them tick and uncover their secrets to success. So that's exactly what we set out to do a little over 3 years ago. We first used a rigorous methodology. It took us almost 9 months just to identify the organizations that you're seeing represented up here on the stage. We did a national peer survey of executive directors of other nonprofits and asked them to nominate who they thought was the highest performing organization in their field. We surveyed almost 3,000 folks through the Case Center at the Fuqua School of Business, and took those responses and then interviewed a number of field experts to help us determine what were the right metrics to use within each field to figure out which were really the highest performing organizations that have had the most impact in their fields in the last 30 years. We then spent almost 2 years going out and interviewing many of the folks who are represented here today, along with other members of their senior management teams, and coming up with the 6 practices that constitute the practices in the book. This is just a list of all the organizations. Obviously, we have Teach for America, Self-Help, and Environmental Defense represented here today. We also profiled organizations like America's Second Harvest, Habitat for Humanity, and some others that you might be less familiar with. And I think for us, the biggest surprise, and where we're going to spend the bulk of today's panel talking about, the biggest surprise for us was when we went in with our sort of MBA hats on, our consulting hats on, we were really expecting to find best management practices. And what we found that in fact a lot of the myths of the nonprofit sector around it's all about building your brand or growing your organization as in scaling out to more sites and having a bigger budget. In fact, a lot of these things were not necessarily true. So as these kind of myths of nonprofit management fell by the wayside, we were looking for other patterns, and what we saw emerging was something quite different. And really, I think the big aha for us in the book was that these organizations spend as much or more time focused externally, outside their 4 walls, as they do on their internal operations and management. So what do I mean by that? Well, there were 6 practices, many of which are about finding points of leverage in systems around them and literally creating larger systemic change. So these include advocating and serving, and the power of engaging government and policy change. Secondly, making markets work, and we're going to hear more about that. Both self-help and environmental defense have been the leaders in this area, engaging the private sector and figuring out market mechanisms to increase social impact. Third, inspiring evangelists and really building social networks around their organizations so that they inspire other people to become advocates for their cause. Fourth is really nurturing nonprofit networks. What's, I think, typically in the field been called building coalitions, but it goes far beyond that. We found that many of these organizations actually take more of an open source approach and give their ideas away and help nurture and incubate other nonprofits' ability to implement their model without necessarily having to control it themselves. They're all great at adapting and being innovative. In fact, we say in the book we call these leaders social entrepreneurs, even though not all of them would necessarily use that term to describe themselves. But they're all incredible at innovating and constantly changing their tactics so that they can have more impact towards their larger goal. And lastly, they've all really figured out ways to cultivate leadership, not just within their own organization, but within the larger field. And so it's a very decentralized, kind of network-oriented view of leadership. So if you want to learn more about the practices, you can read the book, but we're also going to spend a lot of time bringing some stories to life around these practices today. So I'm going to sit down. I'd really, is this mic on? Sorry. I'd actually like to start, well, I'll talk loudly, talking a little bit about the advocacy practice. And in particular, I know a lot of nonprofits in the field shy away from getting engaged in political debates or in the policy fray. And what we found was that these organizations actually realized that policy advocacy can be a significant lever for greater impact. And I think in particular, environmental defense and self-help have both figured out ways to create enormous change through policy advocacy. So David, why don't you start responding to this, and then we'll have Mary weigh in as well.
Sure. Thanks, Heather. I understand the reluctance to get into advocacy if you're uncomfortable taking off the gloves and playing in those venues, but the fact is that if you have a really great idea and you want to leverage it, finding the right way to propagate it almost inevitably leads to the public arena. And for those of us who find it important to grow our organizations and to extend influence, it's essential to be able to work in policy. And you can do that while staying true to your ideals and maintaining the integrity of your organization, even with others in the same field. And I think there's another compelling reason to extend influence and to participate in advocacy, and it's because of the trends in how people see nonprofits in general. They expect leverage. And when funders expect leverage, when investors expect leverage, and you don't take that avenue, I think you'd have to, you'd have to be able to achieve some other multiplier effect. And it strikes me that public advocacy is just one of those natural tools.
Yeah, but can you maybe just give a real quick example around like the California Global Warming Solutions Act and legislation pending in Congress right now?
Yeah, yesterday was a watershed day. It probably wasn't mentioned in any of your newspapers because newspapers don't write about events that happen in subcommittees of committees in Congress. But they can be incredibly significant. Someday when the history of global warming legislation is written in this country, and that legislation will pass sometime between now and 2009, yesterday will be a watershed day, because yesterday the key Senate subcommittee voted to send world-changing climate legislation to its parent committee, and once its parent committee approves it, it'll go to the floor of the Senate sometime between the next 60 and 90 days. And we've been working on this for years. We have, dozens of people working on this, at least part-time, if not full-time, on the federal level. On the state level, we were privileged to co-author, along with NRDC in California, the most sweeping climate legislation in the country. Coming from California, I'm proud of the fact that California has always been a bellwether, a model, and a leader for the rest of the country, and it was really an honor to be able to be a part of that.
Thank you. Mary, can you tell us a little bit about how self-help first got involved in advocacy around anti-predatory lending?
Sure, and I guess I want to say that changing systems and policy was really always a core part of self-help strategy from the very beginning. And as an example, we have a credit union that's one of the 4 institutions that we work through. And so early on, it was focused on changing credit union policies to serve our low-income constituency more effectively. And then as another example, back in the early days of the Clinton administration, we were very, very active with a number of other institutions like ours in creating the CDFI fund, which is a department of the Treasury that has probably put close to $1 billion of equity financing into institutions like ours around the country. So it's always been a core part of our strategy, partly because we're a $1 billion financial institution today, which is pretty large in our movement, but it's a handful of Bank of America branches. So we always realized that you had to be focused on changing policy and practice in order to really, really have increased impact. And I think the second part of that is we're very, very informed by our lending, and we're incredibly effective as advocates because we're lenders. So when we go into Congress or go into work with other financial institutions, we say we're a lender, we're a subprime lender. We've done all these loans, and that really informs our ability to serve as an advocate. And how we got into the predatory lending work was about 10 years ago, 1997. A borrower, one of our loan officers, came into our CEO and said, "Can you help me understand what, I don't understand, I have this guy coming in trying to refinance his loan, and I don't understand. I've looked through his loan papers." And as we began to dig into it more, what we saw was here was a man who'd owned his home for decades, and he had a $40,000 loan, of which $29,000 was the actual principal of the loan, and all the rest were fees that had been built into his home, and the home was about to go into foreclosure, and he was about to lose it. And so we started to do a little bit of research and realized that the company that had given him his loan was called the Associates, and the Associates had 18,000 loans just in the state of North Carolina alone, and through about half of which were predatory in the same way that this man's loan was. And that within nanoseconds, this one company was going to wipe out the 20 years of work that we had put in trying to build wealth in communities across North Carolina and the nation. And so we quickly jumped into the fray, and because we generate a lot of our own earned revenue, and because of relationships that we'd built across North Carolina, within 6 months we've been able to build a coalition of about 100 other financial institutions and housing nonprofits and others in North Carolina, and to get a law passed in North Carolina, which in 6 months, that's pretty fast turnaround to move a complicated piece of legislation. And that became the nation's first anti-predatory mortgage lending bill in 1998. And we kind of thought, well, that's great. We'll share what we know with anybody else around the country that wants to learn from us. And hopefully this will happen in other states across the country. And pretty quickly we began to learn that the legal and financial expertise that we had as lenders was kind of a gap that was missing with a lot of advocates around the country. And so that led us in 2002 to create the Center for Responsible Lending, which is now a 50-person affiliate with offices in a number of places around the country. And we've worked in some, I think, 22 states. And in the same way that David was talking about legislation that they're working on, we have really become the go-to organization for particularly any mortgage legislation, but around payday. It has allowed us to take on a wider array of responsible lending issues and have, are kind of at the crux of any legislation that's moving through Congress and through state capitals across the country.
Great, thank you, Mary. One of the backstories to this whole legislative advocacy piece is how Self-Help was able to build a real network and coalition of organizations in North Carolina to help pass that initial legislation. And I think we found that that's true. Many of the organizations we studied, that they are very adept at sort of being leaders among leaders in their fields, and also building and nurturing nonprofit networks, whether or not they're formal affiliates or have any kind of formal brand affiliation. And so, I was hoping actually that, Ami, you could talk a little bit about how Teach for America has done this, through your alumni network.
Yeah.
And then we'll hear from Anne Marie a little bit about some of these concepts as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think what, we really believe is that we really do hope that our core members who then become alums will become agents for change in all different sectors. And definitely one thing that we realized when we stepped back right before 2005 and really thought about building our plan to go to 2010 was that we were not being as, supportive of our alums when it came to just thinking about political office and the power that people in office have. And so one thing that we were really charged by David Gergen at Harvard to do is to really think about how we might look by 2010 to ensure that we were at least presenting our alums with the opportunities to think about school board leadership and to think about, being congressmen and women one day. But that usually takes getting on the path of leadership in terms of politics. And so what we've done is basically created a goal around, by 2010, having 100 of our alums in political office. And that can range from, again, school board leaders to, and maybe a small town mayor or things like that. But that hopefully eventually it will be that, when we look at our country's political leadership down the road, that there will be folks in those seats who've had the experience of teaching in the classrooms in which we teach, because then we really know that they will approach, hopefully, their work with that knowledge and that mindset of what it could really take to change the educational playing field for all kids, which we deeply believe is a changeable playing field. So that's sort of how we've gone at that.
Yeah, and I would just add one note that when we're talking about Teach for America, and we use this example in the book, if you evaluate them on their impact in the classroom, it's significant. They're really making a difference in the lives of children all over this country. But I think the real phenomenal story that a lot of people missed early on in Teach for America's founding was the power of this network of advocates for education reform that they've built nationally. So if you look at the Eli Broad Foundation, New Schools Venture Fund, KIPP Academy, a lot of the charter school networks are being launched by Teach for America alumni, and so it's the real power of this alumni network that is creating a systems level change, and I think we're going to see more of that, as you said, as these folks start running school boards, state, and elected office.
Yeah, definitely. We really feel like our networks have pushed us in all different sorts of wonderful directions as we continue to think about how to increase our impact. And one thing that we just realized was that in order to have more alums out there doing things like running for political office, we just had to have more core members. And basically, we realized that we needed to double our presence in the schools in which we were teaching and the communities in which we were working. So really scaling from about 4,000 core members in the midst of their 2-year experience to 8,000 core members will be in the midst of their 2-year experience by 2010. Because basically, when you're going after what we hope is some of our nation's most promising future leaders, that does just create this domino effect in terms of where that group of people will go and what they will do first and foremost in their classrooms with those students in terms of shrinking the achievement gap. But then afterwards, how that can bubble out can happen in various different ways in terms of the sector. And we also just have heard constantly from those organizations that you mentioned, Heather, but also just from our school districts and our university partners about how absolutely critical it is that we take networking seriously in terms of our unique position to help feed the talent pipelines.
Anne Marie, I know at Draper Richards you're building a real network of social entrepreneurs who are very early stage, and you guys are figuring out ways how to support this network. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about how you think about these ideas in the context of your work?
I think a lot about networks. I think about them as signaling mechanisms, and then I also think about them as really effective execution, model execution networks as well. And like I guess any pool, I see them as having a lot of ripples. And Heather's right. We spend a lot of time trying to build a network of the people that we fund. They tend to be in a lot of different fields. They do a lot of different kinds of work. But they're all at about the same stage in their life stage. And what's always surprising to me when they come together, and whether that's on the phone or live, is the willingness that people have to share what they know and who they know. And I'd have to say that I think that those people are the field builders. They're the people that actually change the trajectory of the entire field. And we now really look for that when we fund people. So if someone doesn't seem to have, and maybe this sounds a little bit judgmental, a fairly collaborative sense about them, meaning that they seem like a person who trades in information and they're as equally willing to give it as to get it and to use it, they're probably not a good fit for the portfolio. And I'm not sure 3 or 4 years ago we recognized that like we do today. So that's sort of one level of nesting. But I'd also say that we look for people that build the fields in which they sit. And that could be on a fund development playing field. Like I look at the guys we fund, there's a group of them that are working in bottom of the pyramid work, and they're doing a lot of small and medium enterprise work. There's a handful of them. And they've been so generous. Now they're much more close competitors, quite arguably. But they're very good about sharing their funding sources. They're good about sharing when things go well and don't go well. They're good about sharing potential board members when they're not a fit. And I, as a person who came from the for-profit sector, I'm always a little in awe of this. I've seen it happen many times, and I'm shocked every single time still, because I think there's a certain spirit of generosity, and I guess you could say it's about paying it forward, but I honestly think it's more about a belief that if the water rises, all the boats will rise, and if the water doesn't rise, some boat needs to rise, and if it's not yours, it's still important that that boat move to where it can get to. And I'm always really humbled by that. So that's sort of the second realm. And the third realm, I think, is a very different field piece. And it's probably slightly impacted by the fact that we tend to support pretty innovative people who tend to be sort of at one cusp of the work that their field is doing. but the willingness for people then to reach out to others that are potentially not doing things that we would say are as innovative, but are very important and that move a field as a whole to a new place, and the ways that people reach into communities to create those kind of impacts, I'm always really surprised by that too, because it's quite time consuming, and I think you have to believe that what you have learned has value for the group in which you work, and that the network of people you serve is not just the people you intuitively serve, but the field in which you work. And I actually think that usually comes back to be a fairly believable dynamic.
Right, it's enlightened self-interest, not just pure altruism.
Yeah.
One of the other findings in our book was around market forces and partnering with the private sector. Given, the mission and context of net impact, I'm sure it comes as no surprise to folks in this room, but many of these nonprofit leaders were really at the forefront of embracing corporate partnerships, and not just corporate partnerships, but also social enterprise, earned income, and really borrowing models and economic thinking from the private sector to help transform larger industries and business practices. So, I think, Mary, you touched on it a little bit before when you were telling the advocacy story and talking about how you also influenced business policy, but it would be great to hear you talk a little bit more about, I know early on you took $50 million from Fannie Mae and managed to leverage that up, and had some phenomenal corporate partnerships where you've actually seen corporations take on your model and scale it much larger than you could alone. So could you talk a little bit about that in your work?
Yeah, sure. I think, in some ways it's easier for us, and I think you point this out in the book, but we're a community development financial institution. So we're, by definition, kind of a hybrid organization or a bridging organization. So what we realized many years ago was that there was a great potential for partnership between banks who have a regulatory obligation. How many of you are familiar with the Community Reinvestment Act? Yeah, so banks have a regulatory obligation to make loans within their geographic service area. But what happens is, for a long time there was sort of imperfect market information. There was this myth that low-income borrowers were not going to repay loans very well. So an organization like Self-Help was able to demonstrate through millions and thousands of homeowners that actually we have a comparable default rate to those of banks. And in fact, given what's going on with foreclosures and stuff in this country today, we probably have a better default rate than a lot of our fellow financial institutions. But a problem that, so we were able to convince banks to start lending to this market, but then what they realized was they were making fixed rate loans that they had to hold on their balance sheet because Fannie Mae, I hope you guys are familiar with the idea of Fannie Mae as a secondary market. Fannie Mae was not able to buy these loans because they didn't meet their risk profile. And so that created an opportunity for us to, in essence, develop a secondary market for low-income home mortgages around the country, which is what we were able to do. We demonstrated it in North Carolina for about 4 years, and then through what Heather referenced to, went to the Ford Foundation, who we happen to know had a big payout. This was in the late 90s when foundations were, the stock market was doing really well. And they gave us a $50 million grant, which we promised to turn into $2 billion worth of home mortgages through a partnership with Fannie Mae. So what, in effect, and so this program has been going on for 10 years now, and we've done about $5 billion worth of lending through that. And so essentially what we do is we work with banks around the country, and we together develop what's called the underwriting guidelines, or the guidelines that you use to work with low-income home buyers. These are all first-time home buyers. And these guidelines are more aggressive than what the banks would normally do. And then we buy the loans from the banks. We turn them into mortgage-backed securities, and we retain what's called the credit risk, or if there is a loss on the loan, we take that ourselves. that allows Fannie Mae then to buy the mortgages from us. So it has become this very, very efficient recycling mechanism for low-income loans. And at the same time, it builds up the market knowledge. And there's a big research study going on that gives information to the private sector that allows them to begin to, it has really changed practice in the field. So that's probably enough.
One of my favorite stories that we tell in the book is about environmental defense and how their informal motto for the first 10 years was "sue the bastards." And they really started out in advocacy and going after corporate America with lawsuits to ban the use of DDT and pollution in the 1970s. And then they had a real sea change in the 1980s when Fred Krupp, who's still the leader there now, realized that they needed to find a way to work with business to change business behavior. So I think that they have really been at the leading edge of not only corporate partnerships around sustainability and so on, but also helping develop models like cap and trade that figure out how to create economic incentives for businesses to do the right thing by reducing their pollution. So David, I was hoping you could share a little bit more and maybe tell us about what you're doing with Walmart, in addition to the legislation, which you've already talked about a bit.
Okay, so you will live in a carbon-constrained world. The question is, what will that legislation look like? What will that structure look like? There are two competing ideas. One is an idea that will unleash innovation and send market signals to entrepreneurs and venture capitalists across the world, and will cause a tidal wave of investment and green energy to be brought to the fore. The other is a tax. You can guess which one we support. The idea of starting with the environmental benefit, and the best science now tells us that we can stand 450 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere ultimately, is our goal. We start with the science because in the end the atmosphere is unyielding. It doesn't care about any given company's growth curve or its PE. So we start with the environmental goal. The way to get there is to cap our emissions over time with a sliding scale to slow, stop, and reverse those emissions. And by putting a cap on, you send a market signal to people that it's worth investing over a long term, and amazing things will get invented and will bring down the costs over time. The other alternative is a tax. There's no way to know how high a tax to set to achieve the environmental benefit. And if you think that Congress is going to go back and repeatedly over a series of years and increase taxes, you're betting on the wrong horse. So that's one way that we bet on markets. A very specific example, Walmart. A brilliant MBA came to me that works with us in Oakland, came to me a couple of years ago. She said, I've got a really weird idea. It's just really a goofy idea. She said, everybody else who works with Walmart has an office in Bentonville. And I said, that is so smart. So we have 2 people in Bentonville. And, I really like those odds. That's one of us for every 800,000 of them. Because we started with just one person. So, we're really cutting that down fast. So why are we working with Walmart? 30,000 Chinese suppliers, 8% of China's exports. Just an extraordinary opportunity to work where the work needs to happen after the U.S. takes a cap. So there's a lot of arguments about should you work with Walmart. My answer is until they prove otherwise, can you afford not to? Walmart's going to realize $350 million in energy savings this year, in part because of work that we've done with them. They've proved to be a willing partner. They are Walmart. They act like Walmart in all regards, but we're there to work with them. And then I'll talk about our partnership with FedEx. 4 or 5 years ago, we approached FedEx, said, how would you like to reduce your fuel expenses by half? They said, that's a big number. The problem was there wasn't a transmission, there wasn't a hybrid diesel engine. We brought those people to the table, and FedEx is in the process of converting to an all-hybrid fleet. But the really good news is competition has arisen, as happens with markets. So now UPS and the Postal Service are working with different technologies and partnered up with EPA to do pilot projects on hydraulic hybrids. So we're agnostic. I mean, we're agnostic about the technologies, whether it comes to climate, whether it comes to FedEx or UPS. What we're in favor of is setting the right framework and setting the right market signals. We did that in the early 1900s when we worked with the first Bush administration to help on the Clean Air Act, and the result is that acid rain has largely been fixed as a problem because of a cap and a trading system, all market-based.
Well, and I know that you, part of why you got there was under the leadership of Fred Krupp and also the senior team that he's been able to build in the organization. And we found this pattern time and again that in these organizations, while it might have been started or led initially by, a lone social entrepreneur, in almost every case, over time, they built really strong and empowered executive teams, and they figured out how to build their leadership bench strength within their organizations and really share leadership in a collaborative fashion, as well as sharing leadership in their larger networks. So, Jim Collins talks about the level 5 leader. We joke that we discovered the level 6 leader, who not only puts their organization's needs above their ego needs, but also puts the cause or the larger mission, the impact that they're trying to have above their own ego needs. And so for us, again, it was a really striking pattern. And in addition, they all invest in their capacity as organizations and build the capacity they need to sustain their impact. So I wanted to just touch briefly on this theme of leadership. And I thought, Anne-Marie, maybe we could start with you on this one in terms of you guys are thinking very early stage social entrepreneurs when it often is that one person with the crazy idea. But how are you thinking about leadership in these organizations as they evolve and grow?
I think there's two pieces. We really do look for leaders who are quite capable. We look for people that are sort of almost comprehensive in their ability to do certain things, at least at the beginning. So someone who can be an evangelist and can also execute, and someone who can build at least moderately complex strategy, and then at the same time can actually figure out how to pick up the phone and call a very specific individual and get them involved. So that's a piece of what we think of when we think of leadership. But we also think about people who are actually willing to cede away leadership, maybe not on a dime, but who have the ability to understand the obvious things, what they're good at and not good at, and be able to cede away certain responsibilities over time. And then there's a practical part. I mean, there's actually some people who are good at a lot of things, but you also have bandwidth constraints. You actually have areas where you can have higher leverage, regardless if you're good at certain things. And someone who actually has the self-knowledge to be able to recognize that, that's a person that we look for too. We look for people who are able to identify folks on their landscape who can help them, which maybe sounds like a really obvious thing, but I'm always surprised by people who, when I say, who are your advisors, they say, well, right now I'm building my idea, and then when I have a good idea, I'll find advisors. This always seems very unintuitive to me. It seems to me that if you have a nugget of an idea, there by definition should be a group of people who can give it breadth and richness, and you should be nailing those people down right away. You should be finding ways to build that cadre of people because they actually get you to that wider network of people. And at the same time, they begin to feel ownership for your idea, which is really, I think, in many respects, what you're trying to get to. And I also think that we look for leaders who are really pragmatic, who actually understand sometimes what it means to have an 80-20 rule. It's easy to say, but when you're doing fairly idealistic work, it's actually very hard to execute on that. To sometimes cede something away and say, this is not about the war, this is about this battle. And so therefore, I'm not going to worry about what the outcome of this particular discussion is. I'm going to walk away from this grant that's asking too much of me in terms of reporting. I'm not going to hire this person because somewhere deep down, I feel like even though they're the fit for now, they're not going to be the fit in 6 months. And I'm going to let go of some of those things. But I think pragmatism is another piece we look for. And we also look for people who actually have fairly robust hiring strategies. And there's a pragmatic reason for that because you actually have to raise money to find those people. There's a pragmatic piece around it because you should be scanning your horizon every morning when you wake up for those people. And if you don't have a plan for who they are, then when they pass you on the street, they keep right on walking because you haven't actually visualized what that team could look like. So we define leadership pretty broadly, and then we look for people who can really realize something and see something that's fairly far down the path, that's well beyond the programmatic. It's easy to say, I want to serve this many kids in this way. It's quite another thing to see the infrastructure you're going to be within and the environment that you're going to live in to do that. And so that's what we think of when we think about leadership.
Right. Well, and I know that, we've heard a little bit about how Teach for America is a leadership machine. And, they're now out competing a lot of the, top tier consulting firms and investment banks on college campuses. And I think a lot of it's been about, leadership. So, Ami, can you talk a little bit about your philosophy in terms of your core, but then also within your organization?
Definitely. I mean, so, we will, get probably around 20,000 applicants to apply to Teach for America to teach in our core for next year, so beginning next fall, and we will take people through a very rigorous selection process to really determine who truly has the personal characteristics to go into classrooms every day that are considered under-resourced and also facing students who often are, deemed by our society to have some of the greatest social ills, and then shrink the achievement gap between their students and students in higher income communities. So finding that person, no matter how bright they are, is actually really tough. Like, we have to make sure that we're really getting to the core of whether or not someone can really sustain that themselves personally. And so after we do that process, we will probably end up this year with about 3,500 core members who will start teaching next fall. And, like I said earlier, we're on this path to try to get to 4,000 incoming core members so that we have 8,000 core members in the midst of their 2-year experience. But that front end, like ensuring that we're getting the right people in our classrooms, is incredibly important, because it then drives everything. We were talking about a little bit earlier in terms of then those folks become our alums, and then they go on to hopefully found, schools like KIPP and work in school districts and lead school districts, and just do a wide range of all sorts of things to ensure that kids are having a more equal chance in life, no matter what sector they decide to go into. But at the foundation of Teach for America, when we get those folks in the door and we take them through our 5-week summer training, our foundational text is called Teaching is Leadership. I mean, that's what we believe, and that's why we go so aggressively and try to beat out the investment banks and other sorts of institutions for that leadership coming off of college campuses, because we believe that's what it's actually going to take to solve this problem, which we believe is a solvable problem. And so, we really want to make sure that we're finding the right people in that way. And then when it comes to our staff, so when you're having that sort of growth go on in the core, then you have to look also at your staff and ensure that you have the right leadership on the team, and then also that you have a pipeline for leadership, which is something that we have without a doubt realized that as we have grown pretty quickly as a staff as well. So when we went into this growth plan going from 2005 to 2010, we had about 200 people on our staff, and now we're at over 850, and by 2010 we'll be over 1,000. And so again, we have to make sure that when we're selecting people for our staff, that they have the right characteristics and makeup, and honestly are able to operate at a very high level against our core values of relentless pursuit of results, disciplined thought, sense of possibility, respect and humility, and integrity, in order to basically, come to work every day and wake up and be very supercharged to be driven to do the work that we need them to do in order to support our core members and our alums. And what we've learned in this last, we're clearly in the 3rd year of this growth plan, is that we actually needed to really call out what the core competencies were to be on staff, beyond the core values which drive everything at Teach for America, and really develop a leadership development system that is going to enable us to really think strategically and thoughtfully about our talent pipelines internally and for the external nonprofit education sector. Like, we feel a deep sense of commitment to being able to generate great future leaders for other places, and we really hope to have a system that is similar-ish to the one that I think a lot of people know in terms of General Electric, where they develop people over time within GE, but often those great leaders go on to lead other companies in other places. And we just feel like that it is critical for us to be able to do that, and it has taken really investing in our capacity and the capacity of our people and our leadership to make sure that we're on that path.
So I'm going to ask just one final closing question for all of the panelists, and then we want to open it up to you guys to ask your questions. So be thinking about, in particular, questions that will have relevance for the larger audience, and if you want to approach people about getting hired at one of these organizations, I would ask that you do that later. So why don't we, so I guess my last question for you guys is, first of all, if there are any closing thoughts on some of these practices we've talked about, but also how are you thinking about increasing your impact going forward? You've already proven that you've all had significant impact, but I also know that all of you are obsessed with continuing to increase that over time. Anne-Marie, do you want to start, and we'll just go straight down the line?
You know, it's a very tricky thing when you're a selector of people that grow, but you yourself don't necessarily have plans to grow. Although we have conversation about that from time to time. I will observe, though, that in the last 5 or 6 years, if you take sort of the meta trends that I feel like we're part of as a foundation, there's a greater recognition that leadership has value in the nonprofit sector. I mean, I came from a very traditional social service background, although previous to that I was a for-profit person. And I honestly felt often sitting in meetings that leadership actually didn't have value, that I could honestly do a variety of things and the outcome would have been the same, and the recognition that there actually were choices to be made would not have been particularly important. I'm fairly certain of that. I do think there's a more burgeoning belief that leadership matters, that outcomes and impact actually matter, and that being planful makes a difference. And I feel like maybe part of the role we play in that is we tend to be fairly big evangelists, both to other foundations and to individual donors, about the importance of holding people accountable for choices and about making planful decisions. So I think for us that's a piece of what we do that drives the growth. And the other piece is a much more stick-to-your-knitting piece. I would estimate that in my work I spend 2/3 of my time sitting on boards. We sit on the boards of everyone we fund. I'm on 7 nonprofit boards. And so for me, there's a real discipline around sitting in every board meeting I'm in and asking, what am I seeing here? Where is the pattern recognition moment? And what can I take that I learned somewhere else and bring it here? Or what relationship did I see that did or didn't stick somewhere that I can allow to make a difference in this place? And I, for myself, and my colleague Jenny the same, when we sit and read a book like this, that creates a tick list for us. And when we do a check-in with someone, I'll actually go through and say, we just had Heather and Leslie come and speak to our group of grantees, but I'm putting together a checklist. So I'm going to say to people, I want to do a call with you, and I just want to talk about leverage around networks. I just want to talk about leverage around markets. And we can maybe move past it and say that for you is not a discipline that matters. Or we may say, wow, there's a whole nugget to be unpacked here of opportunity that we're not maybe entirely taking advantage of, and we should. So I feel like for me that's sort of our meta picture, and then our more micro picture are using opportunities that we see to really push people to be leveraged. I mean, when I was in business school, there was this really popular book called Guerrilla Marketing or something, but it was one of the very first times where people, I think, actually said, like, leverage is important. Being a guerrilla something is important. That's the GUE, because when I use that word with my daughter, she always thinks it's the large GOR. And I think actually that's the name of the game anymore. Nonprofits are never going to be big, or at least there's not going to be a lot of them that are going to be big. And there's a certain question, I think, around allowing people to come together to be big, but there's also a piece about using smallness to be effective. And I feel like for us, that's the other place where we're beginning to discover how we can give people thought leadership around that topic.
Great, thank you, David. I know you guys are in the midst of a big growth campaign like American.
I think looking forward, 3 things come to mind. One is that we have to be highly selective and relentlessly focused. Mm-hmm. We just can't get distracted by tangential opportunities, by the occasional generous donor who wants us to pursue something that's not a core competency. We need to have it. We need to adhere to the goals that we've set for ourselves. I think the most important one for me is that we demand multiple benefits from every decision possible. The word I hate most when I hear managers and leaders use it is resources. because resources is either people or it's programs. And it strikes me that every decision you make should have some kind of programmatic benefit with a real genuine outcome, and it should develop the people who are implementing it, working on it, creating the strategy behind it. And so if you're not thinking multidimensionally about approaching virtually every problem and every opportunity, then you're probably wasting some of them. And then it strikes me that one of the other big challenges is dissolving boundaries, because they grow like kudzu. Every organization has a problem with silos. Dissolving those and leaning hard on diversity so that everybody can bring all of themselves to work so that you can function in the new America strikes me as being a critical piece of the future.
Yeah. I mean, I do think for us, I mean, all these practices just really resonate with us, but in particular, the leadership and the networking buckets, because, like I said earlier, we just so believe that it's about getting the right people into Teach for America in order to propel our mission forward. It's an interesting moment for the organization, actually, because we are in the midst of this growth plan, and we appear to be thinking this on track to meet it. And so, we look forward to, by 2010, having the 8,000 core members in the midst of their two-year experience, and just knowing that that is going to start putting us on par with some of our nation's largest school districts in terms of the impact that we can have and should have on those classrooms, and then that turns into more alums. But this is also coming up to a point where we're starting to think about what are we going to look like between 2010 and 2015. So this is the year that we start doing that planning, and so it's going to be interesting for us to actually be able to hear from the networks that we operate in, sort of how people can see us being more helpful and doing what we're doing, like other people have said, staying very focused on our core mission and what we do, but also are there other innovative things that we could be doing to progress Teach for America forward and the greater sector forward. And it's also an interesting moment for the organization because we've received quite a bit of positive pressure from the international community to really be more of a force for helping people figure out Teach for America type programs in other places. And we feel very responsible for helping to provide any resources that we can to helping people think about what that might look like. And so that's really going to be, I think, an exciting, next thing for us to think about, not as Teach for America, but as another part of our organization potentially, and really how we can help the world, bring all kids up to the right educational levels and equity that they should have. That said, I mean, I think what we always feel, and not that we don't have to be incredibly thoughtful about our resources and making sure that our fundraising strategies are good and that we can get to our fundraising goal, but I mean, I really feel like we continue to believe that our biggest constraint is talent, and that we just have to continue to be as aggressive as we are on college campuses, and then also just throughout different sectors in terms of people really thinking about how they might lend their knowledge and expertise to an organization like Teach for America and honestly the broader sector. So as I think about where we'll probably go in 2015 in terms of impact, it's hard for me to imagine that it's still not going to be somewhat around making sure that we're bringing more leaders into the fold and sharing them outwards, and that outwards is probably going to look a little more international maybe than it's looked before.
Great, Mary?
So I'm going to echo some things that were heard because I jotted down similar things. I think one of the key challenges for us is to make sure that the core values of our organization, what I think has made us successful over the past 27 years, get infused throughout the rest of our staff, because 3/4 of our staff have joined within the last 5 to 10 years. So, and interestingly, I think this is interesting, but we went through a values definition process about at the same time that you all were doing this book, and we came up with these 5 core values, and we think we're so special, and it describes our organization. And then when we looked at the 6 practices of this book, it's like, dang, those are the same practically as our core values. It's like service and advocacy and adaptation, and so that was pretty interesting. But I think that issue. Secondly, we're innovating on too many fronts, and so being very, very disciplined about what are our core competencies and trying to remember. We're being asked to get involved in so many different either new advocacy issues or new geographic markets or new products. We have to be very, very disciplined about remaining true to what it is that we're good at and being very disciplined on that front, which I think I heard David mention. And then finally, something that we really still struggle with is how you integrate. We have all of this great knowledge of people making loans on the ground, and then how you integrate that knowledge with the people who are working in Washington, working in state capitals, so that so each appreciates what the other brings to the table, because we talk about that we're not effective advocates without the knowledge that we have and the success that we have as lenders, but we need to really live that out much more effectively internally within our organization.
So we'd like to open it up for questions, and I don't believe we have a handheld mic.
You don't, but I think the room's small enough.
Yeah, so just, why don't you stand up and just say name and what school or organization you're from and ask your question. So, right here, during the right discussion.
Hi, I'm Leslie Edwards. I'm here from the Boston Professional Practice. I work with some things about structure, and the question I have relates to the proliferation of nonprofits. I should learn this recently that 119 new nonprofits are created every day, and there are just under 2 million nonprofits in this country, about 70% of which are under $500,000 in annual budget size. So that represents two things. One, potential for great innovation, and also obviously has a dilutive effect on how resources are allocated in the sector, and obviously a lot of redundancy. So the question, I guess, is a little bit different, but Anne-Marie mentioned thinking about your growth tactics and innovation for entrepreneurs. I know you have a view on that issue with technology and innovation. And then for the panelists, I'd be really interested to hear how, as your organization, this probably goes back years, we're facing your initial scaling challenge, trying to go from maybe a $1 million organization to where you are today. Was there one characteristic of these that you think was the most critical at that point in time, or a particular decision do you think we did when you kind of cross that chasm?
And I do have a pretty specific perspective on this. I came from a sector that was way overcrowded. I would sit in meetings where we would talk about shoring up people that were struggling rather than answering the question, how can we provide services to people given the infrastructure we might have if some of the agencies that were supporting them didn't exist, which is actually one of the reasons I left the sector, because I was afraid I would accidentally stick my hand in a car door while thinking about that. So I have a very strong thought about that. And then I have to admit, when I first thought about funding new nonprofits, I thought maybe that was a bad job for me because I had such a negative feeling about people starting new things. But I will make the observation that innovation is important. I will also observe innovation often does not happen in existing infrastructures because there's too many pressures on the people in those organizations, appropriately, because people are worried about things like mission creep and lack of resources. So I think you always have to have this spigot on for new ideas to come out. And that was how I rationalized taking this job, and I believe more and more that's true. I will also observe, I think the nonprofit environment really does have market mechanisms which are actually broken, that I think if people allowed resources to fall to where they should fall and didn't allow emotional senses of history, not that I'm not respectful of history, and community fabric, not that I'm respectful of that as well, to play their role, that we would actually have proliferation of new, but we would have falling off of old, and we don't actually allow ourselves as communities and as society for that to happen. And I don't necessarily purport to know the answer to that, but that's how I think about creation of new organizations, is I think innovation needs to happen. But I do think that we, as a community, somewhere have to have a dialogue about where we let go of some of our beliefs about what it means for something to live and continue to live past its useful life. Did you have a second part to your question, though, for the panel?
Oh, about what was the critical characteristic or decision that allowed them to scale?
I don't know if it's what, I think one really important distinguishing factor about self-help that I used to be a funder of the organization before I came to work here is its adaptability, really looking at results and what's working, and even when your most deeply held beliefs. Our organization started out focused on worker ownership, and that was the strategy, coming out of the cooperative movement. But it just wasn't working in the target population that they had set out. And so being able to challenge your most deeply held beliefs based on results and adapting then, keep trying and finding that way that works. It's kind of like water's ability to find the cracks. And I think that, coupled with, as a couple people have, the ability to deflect credit to others, to really believe that if you're putting in the work and doing the good work and letting others take credit, that what goes around comes around. Kind of the combination of those two things, I think, is very powerful.
Yeah.
I just wanted to weigh in really quickly on the question about fragmentation and proliferation, because I have a pretty strong opinion on this. I mean, we obviously believe that innovation is good, but smart innovation. And to Anne-Marie's point about letting some of the old die away, I also believe that we need better information, and that part of why the social capital markets are broken is because the information markets are broken, and that we need to move away from looking at things like overhead ratios and the metrics on GuideStar or Charity Navigator and start looking at impact. And that was one of the real challenges of doing this research, and all of these organizations are having phenomenal impact. You would not necessarily know it based on the ratings that we're using as a society. So we're also saying that funders need to double down on the winners. So it's not just about starting the new. And I know Draper Richards is in partnership with Ashoka and other organizations. It's about getting that really great idea or model to scale, and that means not pulling out your money when they start working with government or the private sector, but it's about sticking with the winners and concentrating resources around the winners that are having significant impact. And so I think hopefully that will start to happen with more accurate information in the marketplace.
Lily, right here in the front.
Brandon Tidwell with FedEx, actually, in the Social Responsibility Office. That's the question we have oftentimes is we look at partnerships. We've done a lot with environmental defense. We're entering a new relationship with Teach for America National. But how do we identify? Are there metrics that are coming out? Is there research that's forthcoming that will allow funders to have better decision making? It's almost as if we need a stock market for the nonprofit sector that would allow us to know the ups and downs of what and how we deem success. But as a funder, it oftentimes is about relationships, or I think, as you said before, Anne-Marie, not being able to let that historical relationship go because of some longstanding issue within the company or the relationships with the executives. So I'd be curious to know if you know research or standards that are coming out that will really help the funding community.
I don't necessarily know of standards that are good proxies with the capital markets you see in the for-profit side, but I actually think there's other proxies that exist. I won't say that we're perfect, but I would argue if you, on margin, were to fund a Draper Richards Fellow, that would be a way better investment of your money than a lot of other folks who are doing work. But I would say the same of my peers at Ashoka, who spend a lot of time on diligence. There are actually people whose bread and butter is doing diligence. I mean, I maybe didn't underscore this, but before I make a grant, I probably spend 2 to 3 months combing through your business plan. I'll probably make 20 calls about you to references as well as to people in university settings and foundation settings and the communities in which you work to try to understand you and your work. I'll sit around for half a day on Google just to understand who I perceive your comps to be and how I think you pile up against them. And I know my peers at other foundations do too. I think that's actually the power of venture philanthropy when used well. And I think that it's a very sexy word, and I don't think it's always used in a way that gives it as much credibility as sometimes it deserves. But I think there are proxies for what you're seeking. And I defer to other people if they've heard about a more capital market-like structure. I think there are people that are trying to do that. I haven't necessarily, I've seen about a dozen models. I haven't seen any I think are particularly credible. So I could share with you things I've seen, but none of them have really struck me as something that's going to provide a consistent set of metrics, either within or across fields, that I would necessarily use as a guide now, although I think there's some good thought thinking about it. But I do think that there are organizations that spend a lot of time doing research and comparison that would be a good place to start, who actually are willing. I mean, Heather mentioned this a little bit, but I probably spend 2 or 3 hours a week with foundation, peers, and high net worth individuals talking about the work we do. Because people call and they'll say, can you tell me some places to put money? And we'll talk to, Rockefeller and some other people who work with high net worth people, and we use that as a dissemination strategy as well. So I think that there's at least some of that work going on. But truthfully, on the flip side, it's not always rewarded. Like, knowing that people like you are looking for that kind of feedback would actually be very heartening.
I would add Stanford Social Innovation Review. We cite a couple articles that were published in this journal in our book. There are a number of people who started to write about what's wrong with the system, and there are people who are starting to try and come up with solutions about how to fix it. And we sort of say this in our book as well, that it's not necessarily easy. I mean, the metrics are very different from field to field. If you're looking at the arts versus education, and Marie's point, find the funders who are backing the winners and double down on their picks because they've already done the work. Ford Foundation and Cerdna Foundation were the most consistent funders of the majority of the organizations in our book, and we spent 9 months picking them. These practices can serve as a sort of rough proxy. I mean, obviously we've done the due diligence on these 12, and so we would encourage people to support these 12 organizations. And then lastly, I would say that the Acumen Fund is actually looking at, and I know Paul Brest at Hewlett has been talking about, along with Google.org, trying to start some sort of website that would have ratings that were based on impact and evaluation, not on inputs like overhead ratio. So people are talking about it, and the solution isn't out there in a big way yet.
And can I just say, provide general operating support?
Yes.
Don't provide project grants. I heard it saying, when you buy stock in GM, you don't say, I just want to pay for the tires. I love that.
Hi, my name is Tricia Hensley, and for the last 15 years I've worked with nonprofit organizations. One of the biggest challenges I face is working with nonprofit boards that often were not recruited strategically. Oftentimes they've not been given job descriptions. They've been reassured that, oh, you don't have to fundraise. In your research, Megan, I'm wondering if you found some of the practices of high-impact nonprofit boards and whether you can share that with us.
I'm actually going to defer to some of the panelists on that. I mean, the biggest aha for us was that the boards were all very large and that they were as much about leveraging social networks and influence through government and corporate leadership as they were about governance. So that was kind of a big aha for us because I think there have been so many books written on nonprofit governance, but not looking at the network effects of boards. So I would be curious, David or Ami or a couple of you, when you think about your board leadership.
I think we're pretty clear with our board leadership. They have job descriptions. They know that they're interviewed to find out which of our 4 primary program areas they'd like to be most engaged in. There's a clear expectation, sometimes it's more explicit than others, that if they are of means, that they'll help support the organization financially. So we have a great and active and not too active board. I mean, I think that people on the board are very respectful of what management's prerogatives ought to be. And I think it is because we're pretty clear with them, and we're really careful in the selection process, and we look at the whole complexion of the board. I've been on a couple of boards in addition to that. When I was a journalist, they had to be sort of civic engagement related boards because otherwise it would be a conflict of interest. And in those cases, those expectations were clear as well. But I know what you're talking about, and there are far too many boards where the expectations are fuzzy, and it's just not a clear priority for people going into it.
Yeah, I mean, Wendy definitely spends a lot of time with our board members, and also, like David said, selecting the right board members. I feel like the rigor that we put around selecting core members and staff members is the rigor that we also put around selecting board members to ensure that we have the right group of people to help, guide us forward and also help create leverage for us in the different areas that they have expertise in. And so she has been extraordinarily careful about ensuring that anyone who ends up on the Teach for America board really can be a real player at the table and really can help to provide us with the support and leadership that we need in order to take the organization forward.
I think there's one other piece I forgot to mention, And that is that the ED, the management, and working in partnership with the chair needs to be pretty relentless about getting fresh faces on the board and acknowledging when people have other interests and don't seem to be pulling their weight, and being pretty ruthless about that.
Hi, I'm Margot. I'm from Marshall at USC, and I'm also doing my dual degree with social work. So actually, I have more of a comment, Anne-Marie, to the idea of scaling the venture philanthropies themselves, because I found LA to be extremely slow when it comes to innovative nonprofit work, and we have one of the biggest homeless problems in the nation. We have such an old model of homeless shelters and government funding and political blah. And I've honestly been looking around for some action from more of a social entrepreneur side on these things. And one thing I've just noticed, and the Net Impact Conference always confirms this to me, is that there are hubs of social innovation. One of them is the Bay Area, Boston, New York, New England area. So I kind of just say encouraging that if that model could be scaled and brought to other big cities that may not have a philanthropic community like the Bay Area has, or, it'd be great.
And it's an interesting observation. I think it's a cart and horse question, and I don't purport to know where the cart and where the horse are. I will agree with you that there are definitely hubs of innovation. I was just talking to somebody about this on the way over. And I think it's in the same way you see hubs of innovation around media and technology and a variety of other things. I think that a certain inclination draws people to a place, and that there are certain raw materials that on the margin encourage people to act and reach out in ways they might not. And the reason I say it's a cart versus a horse problem is it is true that there's a lot of money sitting in Silicon Valley and New York and Boston, which are the places where I see most innovation occur. And Washington, D.C. actually too, although I think that's a different reason. But I would also argue there's a lot of money laying around LA. I mean, it's not like the money isn't there. And I think there's an issue of inclination as well. And but I think there's also why people do what they do. What kind of risk is rewarded? I mean, in the Silicon Valley, I think people just have a higher profile of what risk is, and I think they have a higher, I shouldn't say higher, that's not fair, a different sense of what social change possibility is and means. So I agree with you that there's probably a piece around pushing on the venture philanthropy side, but there's probably also some piece that's around pushing on the nonprofit side. I mean, shaking people out of the trees that are doing work who, if they had money to take a risk, might do it. I think it's actually a pretty tricky thing that's not just about where the money comes from, but what motivates people to step out from the pack and do something different. And I have to say that much as I've taken trips to LA, like I'm doing a pitch-off here, and I do pitch-offs in other cities, and I once went to LA and didn't see a single deal, and it wasn't for lack of looking, it was for lack of finding, quite honestly. And I find that very interesting, so I concur with you, but I think it's more than just about venture philanthropy. I think it's about something to do too with the people in a place and what not only can they find money to do, but what they feel psychically or practically they'll find reward in doing.
I think there's an uncovered piece of this, and that is that the media doesn't hold up models of innovative philanthropy. There are more than 1,000 journalists at the LA Times. I'm not aware that there's a single person devoted to covering philanthropy or nonprofits. My predecessor at the Mercury News created the first nonprofit beat at any major American newspaper. So I have a heretical idea. My idea is that in 30 of America's largest markets, hell, make it 50, that community foundations and or major foundations would go to their local newspapers and endow a chair, just like you would at a journalism school. And the reason newspapers would be receptive to this is that they're all hurting financially. And so they would all endow a chair in covering the nonprofit community, the philanthropic community, and there would be no strings attached. Absolutely no strings attached. The only string is the newspaper commits to having that reporter cover that and only that. And the funding entity just lets go of the money every year and commits to at least 3 years. You know, when the American public begins to see the benefits of venture philanthropy, you know, it can have a snowball effect. I saw it work in Silicon Valley.
Thank you all for being here today. On behalf of Young Impact and OE Graduate School of Management, I want to thank the panelists for participating. We have time for about one more question.
Also, there was one person who was going to do a plug, so let's do the question,
Okay.
and then somebody wanted to make an announcement.
Right here.
The word leadership, John Crockett from the DC Professional Chapter. Been about 10 years in mainly international development. You all mentioned leadership a lot, and leadership is a pretty broad category. Is there some key distinctions you can make in leadership at your organizations that go away from the traditional model, kind of a men-know way to look at it, or a different look at what leadership means within your organization that's been successful, either at the CEO level or at the US organization?
Servant leadership.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would say at Teach for America, we believe about our core members as teachers. It's what we believe about our staff, no matter what role you're in, that you're a leader. And that gets exhibited typically through our core values of relentless pursuit of results. So you're relentlessly pursuing the results of your team and your goals, and you're doing that through disciplined thought. And with a sense of possibility and respect and humility for all engaged in this work, as well as integrity and not integrity, necessarily only in terms of will not steal money, but also just doing what's right for the broader good. But we have also realized that at Teach for America, in terms of what we're trying to do, and as we look at our staff, there are 3 buckets of competencies that we've found, again, no matter what role you're in the organization, it's just really critical to have people reflecting on their performance in. And one is managing and operating, and that includes managing yourself if you don't happen to manage people, building relationships and influencing others, and reasoning and strategic thinking.
I would I'll just add 2 comments. These are in the chapter on leadership, but all of these organizations have appointed a COO or the equivalent at a certain point in time in their growth, or between year 10 and 15 when they got to a certain size, so that it's not just the executive director, but they also have somebody very focused on internal management practices. We talked about the board piece a little bit. They also all pay their top talent really well. And so again, there's kind of a virtuous cycle. The more successful you are, the more resources you attract, the more you can then start to invest in your capacity. And so we really think there's a lot of these things that are mutually reinforcing over time, but that paying top talent, finding interesting and creative things to do, like non-management career paths, which environmental defense has done, so that if you're a PhD scientist, you don't have to be in the business of fundraising or nonprofit management. You get to be an expert at what you do. So we have a lot of very practical kind of tips that we sort of pulled out from these organizations and highlight in the book as well.